nothing else will do. I just want you, nothing else, nothing else, no, nothing else will do. 'Cause I just want you, no, nothing else, no, nothing else, nothing else will do. I just want you, nothing else, nothing else, nothing else will do. 'Cause I just want you, nothing, nothing else, nothing, nothing else, nothing else will do. I just want you, nothing else, no, nothing else, Jesus, nothing else will do. I just want you, nothing else, nothing else, nothing else will do. I just want you, nothing, nothing else, no, nothing else, nothing else will do. I'm caught up in your presence. I just want to sit here at your feet, caught up in this holy moment. I never want to leave. I'm not here for blessings, Jesus. Jesus, you don't owe me anything, and more than anything that you can do, I just want you.
Good morning, and we thank you for joining with us this Sunday. We are so thankful that you are with us, and we have a special day planned. I'm going to share from my heart something that I know is on your heart, and it's an issue of injustice and racism that is operating in our world today. But before we get into this very sensitive and difficult subject, let's worship our God. And let's worship and celebrate who we are in Him, that in Christ, we all people are one.
Overwhelmed, but I won't break. Through the battle, I will say, your grace will be enough. Your grace will be enough. Under fire, but we won't fall. We will never be alone. You'll always be enough. You'll always be enough. Now in God we trust. In His name we hope. I know God will not be shaken. God is here with us. He's already won. I know God will not be shaken. We will follow where you go. We will trust in the unknown. I know you go before. I know you go before. In my heart now in your ways, for we carry in your name. Your promise never fails. Your promise never fails. Now in God we trust. In His name we hope. I know God will not be shaken. God is here with us. He's already won. I know God will not be shaken.
You'll finish what you've begun, forever strong in your love.
Good morning, Westlake, and welcome to Westlake
Your
Online.
name is
Let me be the first to say
sure,
Happy Father's Day to all of
and
you dads out
will
there.
fight for
Let's just get our hearts
us,
together
our hope
and lift our voices up to
forever
God.
secure in you alone.
You'll finish what you've begun, forever strong in your love. Your name is sure, and you will fight for us. Our hope forever secure in you alone. Now in God we trust. In His name we hope. I know God will not be shaken. God is here with us. He's already won. I know God will not be shaken. God will not be shaken. My God, God will not be shaken. Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. When I was your foe, still your love bought me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. No shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God.
There's nothing worth more that will ever come close. Nothing can compare. You're our living hope. Your presence, Lord. Have tasted and seen of the sweetest of loves, where my heart becomes free and my shame is undone. Your presence, Lord. Holy Spirit, you are welcome here. Come flood this place and fill the atmosphere. Your glory, God, is what our
Holy Spirit, you're welcome here.
Oh, Holy Spirit, you are welcome.
Come
Flood this place and fill the atmosphere. Your glory, God, is what our hearts long for. To be overcome by your presence, Lord.
Let's pray together. And Lord, we are gathered here in our individual places, our individual spaces. We come to you, Lord, with our own challenges and our own concerns. Lord, the good thing is that when even though we are separate, Lord, you meet us one-on-one, and you meet us as a group, because you say not just that we are your child, but you also call us your children. So Lord, even though we are separated sight by sight, house by house, we come to you, Lord, with one heart, that you heal us, that you heal our land, Lord, that you meet us here in our pain and our challenges and our frustrations. Lord, we are worshiping you right now, right where we are. Amen.
Never met a match I couldn't handle. Get ready for a battle, 'cause you know that I was born for this. I was born for this.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us on this beautiful Sabbath day. I have some good news for all of you Westlakers. Next Sunday, July 5th, we will reopen our doors and have our first live gathering since the quarantine began. Now, when you enter into the church, you're going to find some things different. Our seating in our sanctuary will be different so we can house social distancing. There will be maps and signs that will bring you into the church. Just please follow all of those rules that we have so that we can keep everyone safe. Now, for those of you who do not feel comfortable yet coming to a live gathering, we understand. And that's why we're going to continue to do our live stream. So you can stay home next Sunday and you can join us, or you can come and be a part of the service with us. Either way, we thank you for coming and joining us, and we thank you for viewing there with us there in your home through your television. Micah 6:8. Today we're going to continue. We're going to continue our thought from last week as we talk about systemic racism and injustice. The Lord said in Micah 6:8, what does he desire of us? That we would do good, seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. I want to let you know up front that I'm going to be sharing some information with you that could be a little disturbing. Okay? I just want you to know that as we move into this. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you the pattern of systemic racism and injustice. I'm going to show you how it operates, because there has been a pattern throughout our history of how this functions and operates in our culture. We're going to go all the way back to the 13th Amendment. On December 18th, 1865, the 13th Amendment was adopted, which basically said that all slaves who had been slaves for now 246 years at this point, all slaves were to be free, and slavery was abolished in America. But have you ever read the 13th Amendment? The 13th Amendment states that slavery shall be prohibited except, here's a phrase, except as a punishment for crime. So here's what happened. The United States passes this 13th Amendment that states that slavery no longer will be an acceptable practice in our country. And shortly after that, in the southern states, they passed a law called the Black Code Law. What the black code law stated was that you could not hire a black person. Now think about this. We've got over hundreds of thousands of black people who have now been freed from slavery. Basically, they've been put on the street. They have no job. They have no food. They have no money. And then this law is passed that you cannot hire a black person. As part of that black code law, they also had what was called a vagrancy law that stated if a black man was discovered in public and he did not have a job, he could be arrested and put in prison for a minimum of 3 months. So now we have black men who have been freed by the 13th Amendment, who are being arrested by the tens of thousands, put in prison, and then these prisons lease them out to the plantations from which they were previously freed from. In other words, they're put right back into legalized slavery. They weren't just leased out to the plantations. They were leased out to build the railroads across our country. They were leased out to rebuild the South after the Civil War. You see, racism didn't go away, it just adapted. On July 9th, 1868, 3 years after the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment was adopted that stated that blacks would have citizenship and equal rights. Now think about this. Blacks have been living in this country at this point about 250 years and never had citizenship. Even 3 years after the Civil War, even after the 13th Amendment where they were freed from slavery, they still didn't have citizenship until July 9th, 1868, where they now gave black citizenship and equal rights. But then there was this law passed called the Jim Crow Law. And what the Jim Crow Law basically said is this is kind of my version. Okay, we'll give the black community citizenship and we'll give them equal rights. We'll give them separate equal rights. They can have their own form of public transportation. They can have their own schools. They can have their own workplaces. They can have their own public restrooms. They can have their own restaurants. They can even have their own churches. Racism didn't go away, just adapted. And for over 100 years in this country, America's idea of equality, where blacks were continually treated as second-class citizens. On February 3rd, 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed that gave black men the right to vote. However, in the South, they had what was called a poll tax that you had to pay when you registered to vote, and many of the black men did not have the money to pay that poll tax, so many blacks just didn't vote for that reason only. But there were some that thought they were going to exercise their rights and they were going to pay the price so they could vote. And when they did, and when they showed up to the polls to vote, there was also what is known as the literacy test, only given to black men, where they had to recite the Constitution word for word, and if they could not recite it word for word, they were denied the right to vote. So our laws said black men had the right to vote. But our culture said we're going to deny you that right. Racism didn't go away. It just adapted. Now, I'm going to move through a lot of history, and I'm going to move up to somewhat current 1964, the Civil Rights Act, which legally ended segregation. What a time of celebration for this nation. Maybe now, finally, maybe we're going to make some progress. No more segregation. No more voting discrimination. No more employment discrimination. Maybe now the black community is going to get the equality that they deserve. Don't move too quick. While the Civil Rights Act was moving in front of everyone in the 60s, behind closed doors was a group of people birthing a private club. A private club that is known and exists even today as the American Legislative Exchange Council, or short, ALEC. ALEC is a political lobbying group made up of big corporate leaders and political leaders. And ALEC writes laws at the state and federal level. And so while in the 60s we had this move of civil rights, behind the scenes was this organization called ALEC that was working and preparing itself to confront civil rights. And in 1968 election, President Nixon ran his campaign, backed by ALEC, ran his campaign on this slogan: I will restore law and order. Now, who would argue with that? Who doesn't want law and order in our society? And we ran to the polls, and on that slogan alone, Nixon became the president of the United States. But let me explain to you what the law and order movement was about. First of all, they were going to privatize prisons. We'll talk about that in a moment. They declared war on drugs. They militarized some of our police departments in some of the major cities. All of this led to mass incarceration. Now you could be thinking, as I would think, well, this is not racial driven. This is an issue about crime and order. Well, let me share with you a quote from John Eckerman, who was President Nixon's advisor. He was recorded saying this, and this could be a little disturbing. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. Did you hear that? And black people. You understand what I'm saying, he says. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or to be black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both of them heavily, we could disrupt their communities. We could arrest their leaders. We could raid their homes. We could break up their meetings. We could vilify them night after night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. From 1850 to 1970, 120-year span, the prison population here in the United States fluctuated somewhere between 320 and 340,000 prisoners. From 1970 to the year 2000, the U.S. prison population went from 340,000 to 2.3 million. Many of them, most of them, were drug-related crimes. Now think about this. The United States has 5% of the world's population, but yet we house 25% of the world's prisoners. Think about this. 1 out of 4 world prisoners are incarcerated here in the United States, the land of the free. In 1980, President Reagan spent $30 billion of government tax money to rebuild new and more prisons. Why did they need to build all these prisons? Because racism doesn't go away. It just adapts. Let's talk about this war on drugs. The first thing they did is instead of treating drug use like it was a health issue, they criminalized it. And they focused on 4 drugs. Cocaine, which is pretty much an upper class, high society drug. And guess what the punishment was if you got caught with cocaine? Slap on the hand. But then there was heroin, crack, and marijuana. Now these tend to be drugs of the middle class or poor people, and predominantly the black community. There are black men and women serving life sentences in this country for nothing else but possessing marijuana. Bill Clinton introduced the 3 strikes and you're outlaw, which meant that if you received 3 felony offenses, you would get a life sentence in prison. So think about this. If you were arrested on 3 different occasions with nothing more than maybe your own personal possession of marijuana, maybe a joint each time. Each time it'd be a felony, 3 felonies, you get a life sentence. Sometimes, a black person would get arrested for possession of marijuana first time. Then the next 2 times, he or she could be arrested and not even have any drugs on their possession, but they would get arrested, the drugs would get planted, and they would get 3 strikes, you're out. That's happened more times than you could imagine in this country. Let me give you some stats. Black men account for 6.5% of the United States population. So 6.5% of our population consists of black men. Yet, they make up 40% of the prison population. Isn't that shocking? 97% of those black men never went to trial. 97% of the hundreds of thousands of black men who are incarcerated never had a trial in this country? You might be thinking, how could that be possible? Well, here's what they would do. They would arrest you, they bring you in. They would tell these poor, and most of the time these are inner city blacks, so they're poor. If you confess to this crime and agree to our terms, we'll give you 2 years in prison. If you don't, and you go to trial, we'll give you 30 years to life. And they had some examples where some black men said, no, I'm not going to take this. I'm not going to be set up like this. I'm going to fight for my rights. And they would go to court, and they would fight for their rights, and they would get 25, 30-year sentences. And so what ended up happening in the black community is these black men would take the plea bargain, they would admit guilt, even if they weren't guilty, and they would take a 2-year sentence to avoid a 30-year to life sentence. And there are literally thousands of people, blacks, Hispanics, even some whites, that are in prison today simply because they were too poor to get out. Let me tell you a story. And this is tragic. This happened just within the last 10 years of this country. A 16-year-old black boy was walking home from a friend's house. 16 years old. When he looked suspicious, so he was arrested by a couple of police officers, and they took him and put him in jail. He committed no crime. They told the 16-year-old young man he could post bail for $10,000, which of course he nor his parents had $10,000. So then they said to him, admit to this crime and we'll let you go home. But this young man said, wait a minute, I've done nothing wrong. I've committed no crime. I was simply walking home from my friend's house. I'm going to fight this. And he would not sign their plea bargaining agreement. And he spent 3 years in prison, never, ever having a trial. 3 years. Multiple times, this young boy was beaten. He was raped. After 3 years of imprisonment for no charge, they finally released him. That happened right here in this country. 1 out of 3 black men have been incarcerated and have a felony on their record. Let me say that again. 1 in 3. 30% of our black male population in this country have been incarcerated and they have a felony charge on their record. Now listen, this isn't just about incarceration. This has been planned. Because here's what that means. 1 in 3 black men cannot vote. 1 in 3 black men can never have a business license. They can never own their own business. 1 in 3 black men cannot get a student loan because they have a felony on their record. If you have a felony that is associated with drugs, then 1 in 3 black men cannot receive food stamps and cannot receive welfare. 1 in 3 black men cannot own a gun. Now, you try getting a job as a black man with a felony. See how that works out for you. This is the America that our black families have had to live in. Hundreds of thousands of black men over the past 50 years have been imprisoned, many of them for simple possession of a simple little drug, and many times not even guilty of the crime that they've been charged, forcing families to be broken up, forcing black children to grow up without their fathers. And that's why people say white privilege. Because I have never in my entire life had to grow up in that America. And the reason? Because I'm white. So please, people, when you hear this phrase, white privilege, don't take offense to it. No one is saying it's your fault. They're not blaming you for being white. No one's blaming me for being white. They're simply trying to get us white people to recognize there's two standards in our system, in our culture. There's a standard for whites, and then there's a standard for blacks and Hispanics. And they're not equal. That is an example of systematic racism and injustice. Racism doesn't go away. It just continues to adapt. So, what can we, what should we, as people of God, do about this? And I'm predominantly at this point, I hope no one takes offense in this politically correct culture we're in. You got to be careful with everything you say. I'm predominantly talking to us white Christians. Okay? There are 4 things that I think we can do that could maybe make a difference. 4 things that I'm hoping to lead the charge on here at Westlake for us as a church to do. I shared 2 of them with you last week. I'll just give them to you just in reference. Number 1, awareness. We need to educate ourselves on this issue of systemic racism and injustice. And I've got a wonderful, wonderful resource for you. You can go to smithsonianmag.com. smithsonianmag.com, and you'll find a resource there, 158 resources for understanding systemic racism in America. We need to educate ourselves, folks. There's also a documentary out there that is a very good documentary called 13. If you've never seen it, you should watch it. Again, it will share a lot of this in detail. We need to educate ourselves on what's going on. Number 2, we need to be peacemakers. We need to turn our swords into plowshares. And what I mean by this, as I said last week, we've got to quit being offended by everything it is said. We've got to quit being offended by Black Lives Matter. They're not saying your life doesn't matter. They're simply having a cry that say, doesn't our lives matter too? We've got to quit being on edge on this issue. We've got to drop our swords, and we've got to be willing to listen. We've got to be willing to come together and talk about this in a civil way. Number 3, relationships. We've got to build relationships. When God wanted to reconcile us to himself, he didn't send an email. He didn't make a positive post on Facebook or Twitter. He came down in person. And what that tells us is that reconciliation is incarnational. It happens through real people communicating with one another and getting to know one another. So I want to ask you, as part of the Westlake Community Church, will you be open to start having conversations with your black brothers and sisters? And when I say open to conversations, I want to ask you to be willing to sit down with a black brother or a black sister and just let them tell their story. Because they got one. I promise you they got one. And I promise you their story is different than yours. And we just need to hear it. You're never going to probably experience what they have experienced, but maybe in hearing their story, maybe we can begin to understand better. And it's through that understanding that we can begin to bring healing to our culture and to our society. And then the last thing, the last word is the word commitment. A commitment to action. Now these words are not like, it's not like, okay, I'm going to educate myself and I'm going to drop my sword and I'm going to make a friend with a black brother, sister over here. These 4 things I'm giving you, they're cyclical. We got to continue doing these things. We've got to continually educate ourselves, because here's what I can promise you. the powers to be are working right now on a new strategy. Racism doesn't go away. It just adapts. So we've got to constantly be aware in ourselves of what's going on around us. We've got to constantly be finding out what's happening. And I'm going to help you on that. I'm going to try to lead you and put resources that we can get this information. But we've got to continually be doing this. We've got to continue to be peacemakers. We've got to continue to build relationships. And we've got to continue to commit ourselves to action. I don't think it's good enough any longer for those of us in the white church to not be racist. We've got to become anti-racist. As I said last week, we have too long been silent on this issue historically as a white faith of community. We've been silent. We've been sitting on the curb watching the world go by, and I don't think that's acceptable anymore. We've got to get involved in this civil rights work. We've got to commit ourselves to that. I'm committing myself to it. And I have 3 actions that we can take. I'm sure more actions will come out of this, but I have 3 action steps that I want to lead us in, that we can begin to take in this fight against civil rights. Now, before I give you the action steps, let me say this. I want to commend you as a congregation, because I think as a church, even though we may not have been very active in this cause, I know your heart. I've been here for 14 years, and your heart is for equality. You are a church that is truly open to all people and all races, and I commend you for that. I thank you for that. Now let's take our heart, let's take our passion, and let's put it to action. Here's 3 things we can do. The first thing is this. We've got to get involved in civil rights. We've got to get involved. Part of making disciples is fighting for those who are oppressed. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, he said, do unto others what you would want them to do for you. I'm sure if things were turned and we were in the shoes of our black brothers and sisters, we would ask, we would hope, we would seek their advocacy to come and help us fight this injustice. So as a church, we're going to get involved. How do we do that? Well, I think here's a couple of things that we can do. There are 2 organizations that I have researched and looked at, and what I've discovered so far. There are 2 organizations that I think are out there somewhat on the front lines, and they're doing a whole lot more than just fighting civil rights. They are actually pouring back into the community education. They're helping youth with education. They're helping to find blacks, to help them find jobs. They're working on all areas here. And those 2 organizations, one here in Indianapolis, is called the Ross Foundation. You can just Google it. The Ross Foundation. The other is the National Urban League. You can Google both of these. These are 2 wonderful organizations that are out there working for civil rights. And one of the ways that we can get involved is that we can volunteer ourselves as a church. What can we do with partnering with the Ross Foundation? What can we do in this Urban League Association? What can we do to get involved, put hands and feet to our heart? Second thing we can do is we could peacefully protest. We could go out in some of these protests and join the crowd and just peacefully do it. I would never advocate anything but that. But I think our presence says something. I think our presence says we care and we're going to join you in this fight. And thirdly, as a church that is predominantly white, we need to reconcile with our black brothers and sisters of faith. And one of the ways we can do that is we can begin to build relationships with black congregations. And I want to do that. We're going to have some men groups. where there's going to be some, I got a couple of pastors in the community, and we're going to come together as black men and white men, and we're going to come together as men of faith, and we're just going to begin to pray together. Maybe we're going to begin to have those relational discussions together. But we can come alongside another congregation and say we are brothers and sisters in Christ. And we can begin to bridge this gap of segregation. Now, ending segregation doesn't mean they can't continue to worship where they worship, and we can't continue to worship where we worship. I would love to have a multicultural church, and I hope that happens sometimes. That's what I think that's best. I think when all the cultures come together, that's when you have the best of God's people. You have the environment, you have the experience, you have the background, the backstory. Each of us brings something different to our faith because our stories, our journeys are different. And together, we're much stronger than we are apart. But we can become an advocate. Even though we don't worship together, we can still work together. And maybe working together can begin to bridge the gap of segregation. So we're going to partner with some churches. And we already have some good friends. Pastor Charles Neal, a good friend, spoke here a couple weeks ago. I have a dear friend, many of you know him, Pastor Willie Baylor. There's a great pastor in Brownsburg, Rashad Cunningham, and these are black pastors that are doing a great work in their community. And I know you know some. And so what I'm saying is we as a church, we're going to begin to build relationships. We're going to build bridges with some of our black brothers and sisters, some of our black churches, as part of our strategy in trying to do away with this inequality in our nation. Those are just 3 things we can start. I'm sure we're going to go from there and have other things that we can do. Some of you have, no doubt, ideas, and we'll get ideas as we begin to build this bridge, as we walk across it. But the good news is we're going to start. We're going to start doing our part to make this a better country for all people to live. Pray with me. Father God, thank you that you are a God of inclusion and not a God of exclusion. Thank you that you have a love for the whole world, and your desire is equality for all people. Your desire is justice for all people. Your desire is that we, like you, would be people of mercy and grace and goodness and kindness and humility. Father, I know that it's your desire that this nation or any nation be ripped apart by racism or injustice. And Father, I'm asking you to not only lead me, but to lead Pastor Fran, lead the staff, lead the elders here, lead us as a church in how we can be most effective in fighting against this evil of injustice and racism that is still, at least to some degree, operating in our world today. We love you, Father, and we thank you. Amen.
Peacemaker, fear taker, soul soother, storm smoother, light shiner, lost finder, cloud lifter, deliverer, heart toucher, truth lover. Who other could be giver, provider, heart healer, kind father, who other could be? My Savior, peacemaker to me. Let your peace rule in my heart. Let your kindness fill my thoughts. Let your strength secure my soul. Let your peace take hold in me. Let your wisdom guide my will. Your compassion fill this place. Let my anxious thoughts be still. Let your peace rule in my heart. I need you. I need you. I need you in my life. Lord, I trust you. Believe you. I need you in my life. I know. Heart toucher, truth lover, who other could be? Fear taker, peacemaker.